Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Finlo Costain. Just 13,000 hectares of trees were planted in the UK this year, a drop of 7%, and only 43% of the national target of 30,000 hectares. Tilhill, the UK's leading forestry services company, says that forestry leaders must band together to change public attitudes, particularly to Sitka spruce, but also towards commercial forestry more generally. Xander Mahony is the head of Forestry Investment at Tilhill. I asked him to explain where the problem lies.
Yeah, so we're often asked why we don't just use native timber. And it's the same reason we don't make cars out of gold. They wouldn't rust, but they'd be insanely expensive. So we have great native timber such as oak, but it grows very slowly and it's thus very expensive to produce. That's why we plant spruce. But the issue for planting spruce is regulation and land availability. It requires sniper shots. It's so rare to find land with good access for hauling timber, with no protected species, no archaeology, no peat, that isn't too high of an agricultural grade, doesn't have landscaping sensitivities. And in spite of this extreme complexity, there's no centralized planning. Farmers are wondering on one side why we're planting land they can farm, but then regulation prevents us planting anything else. And both sides think there's this gap between the trees, but it doesn't exist. We have urban planning, but why no rural planning? I often liken the UK rural land use system to Lord of the Flies as a result.
There's been concern that as we start to see an increase in commercial forestry, there's likely to be more pushback from local communities, as there can be with renewable energy. Are you already finding that citizen groups are actively opposing new forestry?
Always. And often it's just the natural human resistance to change, but often it's things such as protecting ground nesting birds or a strong preference for native trees, both of those especially in England, in the UK. But we need to find ways to have more birds, plus more native trees for biodiversity and amenity, plus more commercial timber. Because in the current geopolitical climate, importing so much of our timber is an uncomfortable place to be. But community is an important factor too. People feel a connection with their landscape, and particularly those who work the land are concerned that their way of life is also disappearing. And I'm from an ex-mining area, so I know what a hollowed out community looks like, and we don't want to repeat those mistakes. We're only planting a tiny fraction of the UK's farmland each year, but it is concentrated in certain areas.
When people think of forestry plantations, they tend to imagine block planting, a monoculture of spruce trees. Is that still what we're talking about?
Yeah, and this was the reason for the farming analogy that we've been using. Nobody questions why we plant monocultures of potatoes or wheat. It's the most efficient way to grow a crop, and spruce is our primary crop. Now, forestry regulations these days don't allow for wall-to-wall single species and haven't done for years. The single species maximum next year will fall to 65%. But the next best species after Sitka spruce is the European Norway spruce. And after that, a couple of other North American conifers. In all of these plantations these days, where we're leaving open ground for biodiversity, we're planting natives, but the primary goal is still timber.
And so when you're talking about that, with the 60% of a single species, we're still likely to be seeing essentially spruce plantations, albeit with different species of spruce within it.
Yeah, and some extra variation, because there's a lot of debate about resilience. How do you best achieve resilience in a forest? So we're in this curious position where we're doing what you'd probably not do to achieve resilience, which is to plant lots of one species. But the reality is the one species that we plant is the most resilient species. So and that's because Sitka spruce grows so well in the UK's climate. It's what it's used to in the kind of Pacific Northwest of America and Western Canada and Alaska. But plus it's got all of that kind of rainfall, but it's also got a little more temperature. So it's so happy that it's actually very disease resistant compared to some other species that are struggling more as the climate changes. Yeah. But it is risky, right? Even if it's the best basket, if all your eggs are in one basket, it's risky. So we are developing these other species, but in order to breed trees and get the best genetic stock for different species, it takes a long time, because obviously a tree's breeding cycle is a lot is a long time.
Xander, you made the comparison earlier on with farming, with large fields of potatoes or corn. But of course, there is increasing awareness that perhaps that more monocultural model of farming is too extractive, and that we need instead a more agroecological approach that delivers not only the product, but climate mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity regeneration as well. So how do you combine those various outcomes within new forestry blocks?
It's a very good question. And I think as we switch from solely focusing on the climate issue of emissions to also thinking about the biodiversity challenges that we face, I think that's going to come into question. You know, we've got very efficient at producing stuff from the land, but we've kind of moved perhaps away from some more natural processes. And I think that's somewhere where forestry will probably have to follow farming, because it's possible to make changes and experiment a lot more easily with an annual crop than it is with a crop that takes decades to grow. Once you've kind of committed to your experiment with forestry, it's half a generation before you get another crack at it.
One of the other challenges is the way that commercial forestry is often harvested. When I was growing up, the plantation near me was harvested quite subtly. Some of the trees were taken, but not the whole forest. While now we tend to get large areas of clear fell, which can have a strong visual and emotional impact on local communities. So why does that happen?
Yeah, so it's two reasons. The one of which is efficiency, the other of which is wind. So it's a lot less cost effective to go in and pluck out a few trees at a time. And when you do that, the big issue that you have is that the remaining trees have less protection from the wind, and they'll be at higher risk of blowing down. And the widespread timber damage we saw from Storm Arwen shows what happens to trees when they experience wind that they aren't used to.
Are there nature benefits to clear felling as well, particularly where you've had quite a dense population of trees, to suddenly have the light brought in and the ground disturbed?
I see you're thinking along the right lines, but actually the benefit is when you have different trees of different ages. So if you have a large forest, there's sort of like a minimum viable unit where it makes sense to get the big machines out and get them on site and do stuff. But if you have a reasonably large forest, the idea is that you do what we call restructuring. So you try and have it so different bits of the forest are at different ages. And that has two benefits. One is that different species prefer trees of a different age. Some are very happy with mature trees, some like the freshly planted trees, and some like something in between. And if you're constantly rotating between those, anything that lives in the forest that's dependent on that particular age group can just move on to the next section when you clear one. Yeah. But it also has the benefit of the fact that if you're a forest owner, you don't just get all your income once every 40 years, but it's spread out a little bit from a cash flow management perspective.
Now, as we've discussed, timber products are phenomenally important for storing carbon, but also for replacing more carbon intensive and extractive building materials. Can you just remind us about the gap between demand and supply for timber products in Britain?
Yeah, so we import a fairly incredible 70 to 80% of our timber in the UK, which in the current geopolitical climate is an uncomfortable place to be. And the analogy I often give is that we're actually more self-sufficient in both food and energy, which I think would probably come as a surprise to most people.
So we're talking about needing substantially more forestry. So how do you propose to win the public over?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing is understanding that these beautiful, economical and low emissions timber products require us to grow good spruce in plantations. And after that, I think there's important things that we can do for local communities. Understanding how to share the benefits of forestry and reduce the impact. Simple stuff of, could we make timber lorries less rattly and noisy for people? And then the final of those points is we need more trees overall, both native trees for biodiversity and our well-being, but also commercial timber to help us decarbonize our lives. And rather than fighting over the scraps of new planting that we're achieving, we could be working together to get our country back to a healthy level of tree cover and foster a strong domestic resource.
That was Xander Mahony from Tilhill. More news on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.